The king is dying, and in a move that stuns even his closest allies, he's handing the crown to Prince William and Catherine before it's too late. For the first time in modern royal history, a reigning monarch is stepping back, not in death, not in disgrace, but in fear. King Charles, weakened by a devastating diagnosis, has secretly summoned his inner circle, launching a rushed transition of power that bypasses centuries of tradition. Why now? What drove the sudden decision? And why is Queen Camilla reportedly furious behind palace walls? From covert family meetings at Sandringham to Catherine's tearful acceptance of a role she never asked for, this isn't just a royal shift, it's a full-blown crisis behind gilded doors. Stay with us. What you're about to hear changes everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began not with trumpets or formal declarations, but with a whisper. An uneasy silence that fell over the royal corridors of Clarence House. Staff who had once bustled confidently through their daily routines began moving more cautiously, speaking in hushed tones, and exchanging glances filled with something close to dread. King Charles III, the man who had waited longer than any heir in British history to ascend the throne, was no longer himself. The vigor he once wore like a second skin seemed to dissolve overnight, leaving behind a fragile frame and a shadow of a monarch suddenly outpaced by time. His public appearances, once marked by firm handshakes and polished oratory, grew shorter and less frequent. Photographers struggled to catch flattering angles. Aides stopped releasing detailed schedules. And yet, there was no official word, only staged smiles and forced reassurances that the king was simply pacing himself. But inside the palace walls, panic was setting in. What began as a medical condition had now become a looming constitutional crisis. King Charles was dying, and he knew it. This was not the death that came swiftly in the night or the type accompanied by a nation's long-prepared mourning. This was the slow erosion of a sovereign, a ticking clock counting down not just the end of a man's life, but the final chapters of a monarch's reign that had barely begun. And as the king's strength faded, so too did the illusion that the House of Windsor had control over the future. There was no time for traditional succession ceremonies. There was no room left for slow transitions. The king had to act, and he had to act now. But what would drive a man like Charles, a monarch so steeped in centuries-old tradition, to shatter protocol and crown his son ahead of time? It wasn't just the illness. It wasn't just mortality knocking louder with each passing week. It was fear. Fear that history was repeating itself. Fear that the monarchy, already brittle from scandals, divisions, and a disillusioned public, would fracture completely if left in limbo. Fear that Prince Harry's continued estrangement and explosive claims would cast further doubt on the crown's legitimacy. Fear that Queen Camilla's growing unpopularity would leave a void of support. And perhaps most powerfully of all, fear that Prince William and Catherine were not yet ready, at least not in the eyes of the world. Charles could not afford to simply fade away. He had to create stability before he was gone. And the only way to do that, he concluded, was to anoint his successors while he still had the strength to lift a hand, to speak their names into history with the weight of royal authority. It would not be a full coronation. There would be no golden carriage, no cheering crowds at Westminster Abbey. But it would be symbolic. It would be enough. Or at least, he hoped it would be. The seeds of this unprecedented decision were sown in private, deep inside Windsor Castle, where Charles called for what insiders now refer to as the Twilight Council. Attended by his most trusted aides, select members of Parliament, and senior church officials, this meeting was anything but ceremonial. Some who attended left in tears, others in stunned silence, and a few, it said, left in fury. Because this wasn't just about one man stepping down. It was about rewriting centuries of royal convention in real time. At the heart of it all stood a fractured family. Prince William, torn between duty and dread, reportedly begged his father to reconsider. Catherine, always poised in public, was said to be shaken behind the scenes, whispering to confidants that she feared the crown would destroy their marriage, their children, their peace. Queen Camilla, who had stood by Charles through decades of scrutiny, was reportedly livid that such a decision was being made without her full support. And in the shadows, Prince Harry loomed like a ghost, absent from the council, unreachable by phone, and rumored to be in California, unaware that his birthright was being signed away while he slept. This is not the monarchy the world imagined when Charles finally ascended the throne after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. That chapter was supposed to be one of healing, of unity, of modern renewal. Instead, it is ending in urgency and uncertainty. In this video, we will take you deep inside the most shocking royal transition in modern history. You'll hear from insiders, analyze secret reports, and uncover how King Charles's health crisis forced his hand, triggering a quiet but monumental shift in the British monarchy. You'll discover how this decision affects not just William and Catherine, but the entire future of the royal family. You'll learn why Charles refused to wait, what role the Church and Parliament played behind closed doors, and how the British public has responded to this unprecedented move. Was this a final act of love from a father to his son, or a desperate grasp at legacy before it slipped away forever? As the veil lifts and the hidden truths are exposed, one question remains at the core of this unfolding drama. When duty and mortality collide, who gets to decide the future of the crown? This is not just the story of a man's decline. It's the unraveling of an institution and the story behind the moment when King Charles panicked and crowned his son before it was too late. In the earliest days of his reign, King Charles III appeared determined to wear the crown with a quiet confidence. He had waited longer than any heir in modern royal history. For decades, he stood in the long shadow of Queen Elizabeth II, preparing, watching, and calculating how his eventual rule would carry forward the legacy of the British monarchy. But behind that carefully measured poise, something far more fragile was taking hold, a battle inside his own body that even the best royal physicians couldn't fully suppress. It began, according to palace insiders, with routine fatigue, the kind that could be blamed on travel, age, or the endless demands of a packed royal calendar. At first, Charles himself brushed it off. He was, after all, a man in his mid-70s shouldering a monumental role. But as weeks turned into months, the signs became impossible to ignore. There were missed briefings, a cancelled appearance at a high-profile climate summit in Glasgow, and then came the whispers, staff members confiding in one another about slurred speech, trembling hands, and increasing difficulty with memory recall. None of it was confirmed by the palace, of course. The royal communications team remained as opaque as ever. Any inquiry about the king's health was deflected with vague phrases like, "His Majesty is in good spirits," or "The king is managing a private schedule this week." But those within Clarence House knew better. Leaked memos obtained by investigative journalists suggested a pattern of emergency consultations with specialists, some flying in from across Europe under diplomatic discretion. One name began surfacing again and again in those circles: Dr. Harold Baines, a renowned neurologist known for treating several high-profile world leaders. Though never publicly acknowledged, his private transport logs showed a noticeable uptick in travel to London between November and January, particularly late at night, when his clinic in Geneva was closed. The timing aligned almost perfectly with King Charles's most conspicuous absences from public engagements. Even more alarming, according to an unnamed source within St. Mary's Hospital, were the repeated requests to conduct neurological scans under a pseudonym, likely to avoid the scrutiny of both press and palace leaks. Then came the turning point. In February, during what should have been a simple afternoon garden walk on the grounds of Sandringham, Charles reportedly lost consciousness for nearly 30 seconds. A bodyguard caught him before he could hit the ground. Aides rushed him inside. A royal physician administered a field assessment on the spot. The episode was classified internally as a neurological lapse, though others in the room described it as something closer to a mini-stroke. Within days, Buckingham Palace was quietly put on a modified emergency alert. The red folders containing contingencies for royal incapacitation, usually left gathering dust, were brought out and reviewed. For the first time in his reign, King Charles confronted the true gravity of his condition. Those close to him say he was furious, not just at his body, but at the timing. This was supposed to be his era, the moment he had spent his entire adult life preparing for. He had hoped to modernize the monarchy, champion environmental causes, and carve out a legacy beyond being the man who waited. But as the diagnosis settled in, early-onset vascular degeneration with intermittent cognitive impairment, Charles was forced to reckon with a new reality. He would not be able to fulfill even half of what he had planned. In private, he reportedly became withdrawn. Some nights, according to staff, he refused to eat dinner, opting instead to pace the royal apartments in silence, sometimes speaking aloud to himself. Others described him as staring out of windows for hours, gazing at the gardens below without saying a word. For a man so steeped in duty and composure, these behaviors were unnerving. And then came the letters. Charles, never one for impulsivity, began writing a series of private letters to key figures within his inner circle. Some went to senior members of Parliament. others to the Archbishop of Canterbury, to Prince William, to Catherine, and, most strikingly, to Prince Harry. While the contents of those letters remained tightly guarded, two sources confirmed that they included phrases such as accelerated transition, symbolic crowning, and temporary delegation of royal duties. These were not declarations of abdication, but they were close. It was clear Charles was trying to shape the end of his reign on his own terms, even if his body would not allow him to carry it through to its natural conclusion. His relationship with the Church became central at this stage. Royal tradition mandates that the sovereign is both the head of state and the supreme governor of the Church of England. But what happens when a monarch is too ill to fulfill that spiritual obligation? Conversations were initiated between Charles and the Archbishop in private chapels. There, beyond the eyes of the public and far from the ears of political advisors, Charles asked a deeply personal question. Could the Church bless a non-ceremonial transition of power if the king remained technically alive? The Archbishop reportedly took several days to consult canon law, historical precedent, and his own conscience. He returned with a hesitant yes on the condition that the handover was framed as a delegation of duty, not a relinquishment of kingship. Charles agreed. It would be, he hoped, a soft transition. A covenant of preparation, he later called it in another letter. Still, the legal complexity was staggering. British constitutional law does not allow for a sovereign to half-step out of power. It's either abdication or continued rule. No in-between. And yet, Charles pushed forward. He began working with legal scholars behind the scenes to draw up a framework. One that would allow Prince William to assume most ceremonial and administrative duties, while Charles would remain king in name until his death. The only way to do this legally? Declare a regency of readiness. It was a legal fiction, but it bought him time. Meanwhile, his physical health continued to falter. Security logs show an increase in medical staff rotations at Highgrove. Portable medical units were installed discreetly in the rear of the estate. Charles no longer traveled without a private medical team. And though the public saw him smiling during brief appearances, cutting ribbons, shaking hands, those images were carefully curated. Off camera, he used a cane. In some cases, he was pushed in a concealed wheelchair, only stepping out of it for photos. His voice began to change. Long speeches became short remarks. He started losing weight. Aides were instructed to remain within 5 feet of him at all times in case he lost balance. The once powerful king had become a man tightly managed by the people around him. Then came what some insiders now call the moment. It occurred on a spring afternoon in Windsor. Charles was reviewing military honors to be given posthumously to veterans when he reportedly became disoriented mid-ceremony. Witnesses say he stood in front of a decorated officer, then turned and began addressing an empty chair, mistaking it for a diplomat. The moment was caught on internal camera, and according to two sources, was shown later to Queen Camilla and Prince William in a private viewing session. That was when Camilla, reportedly, broke down. She had supported him through scandals, mourning, and public hostility. But this slow, unraveling loss of control was something no partner could fully withstand. She urged Charles to rest, to take time away, but he refused. Instead, he made a decision. He would anoint his son before he lost the ability to do so with clarity and dignity. It was meant to be an ordinary evening at Windsor Castle, a fortress that had survived centuries of conflict, fire, scandal, and sorrow. But within its ancient stone walls, one moment would fracture the illusion that everything was under control. The room was dim, warmed by the flickering light of an ornate fireplace, and sparsely populated. Only a few of King Charles's closest aides were present, along with his long-serving private secretary and a royal physician discreetly stationed by the door. On the table in front of the king sat a folder, thick, heavy, and sealed with the royal insignia. Its contents were not ceremonial. They were not even political in the conventional sense. Inside was a stark and undeniable truth. A report from a team of royal physicians confirming that Charles's health had reached a point of irreversible decline. No recovery was expected. At best, they gave him a handful of strong months left, at worst, weeks. The king opened the folder slowly, his hand trembling as he flipped through the pages. Each paragraph, each sentence, seemed to steal air from the room. His aides remained silent, knowing better than to interrupt a moment that was as intimate as it was devastating. After several long minutes, Charles closed the folder and set it aside. And then, for the first time in his reign, he wept. Not the soft, dignified tears expected of a monarch, but the deep, shaking sobs of a man staring down the certainty of his own end. His shoulders hunched, his head fell forward into his hands, and his body shook in silence. No one moved. No one dared speak. It was a moment so raw that the gravity of his crown evaporated. He was not King Charles in that moment. He was simply Charles, the man who had outlived his mother, fought for public acceptance, and waited 74 years to rule, only to find himself betrayed by his own flesh. After nearly 10 minutes of silence, Charles lifted his head and looked across the room at his private secretary. His voice cracked, but the words were unmistakable. We're out of time. The breakdown at Windsor, as it came to be known among royal staff, did not remain secret for long. Though no official record was released, word spread quickly through the palace's tightly woven network of courtiers and staff. The very next morning, a flurry of coded emails and urgent calls summoned senior advisors to Windsor for an emergency meeting. The air that day was cold, but it wasn't the weather that sent a chill through the castle. It was the unmistakable sense that something historic was unfolding, and no one could stop it. When Queen Camilla arrived, she found Charles seated in the private drawing room where the Queen Mother once took tea. He was dressed plainly, absent the usual regalia, and his eyes looked darker than usual. She tried to comfort him, tried to invoke his mother's strength, remind him of the legacy he was still building. But Charles, with an eerie calm, simply replied, "It's not my legacy anymore. It's William's now." That was when Camilla reportedly turned away, hiding her tears. For all her faults and controversies, she had stood by Charles with unwavering loyalty. She believed in his vision for a modern monarchy, one shaped by compassion, environmental stewardship, and quiet strength. To hear him speak as if it were already over was a blow she wasn't ready for. But Charles wasn't trying to be cruel. He was trying to prepare her for what he had already accepted. Later that afternoon, he summoned Prince William and Catherine. The atmosphere was heavy. They entered the room cautiously, having already been informed by aides that the king had something urgent to discuss. Charles asked for privacy, requesting that even Camilla leave the room. What followed was a conversation that would alter the course of the British monarchy. According to one senior aide who was later briefed on the details, Charles began with a simple admission: "I cannot go on like this." He then explained his diagnosis in full, omitting no detail. The words hung in the air like ash. Catherine sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. William, struggling to maintain composure, interrupted once to ask if there were any chance the doctors were wrong. Charles shook his head. Then came the real shock. Charles didn't just inform them of his health. He informed them of his plan. He wanted William to begin assuming royal duties immediately, not just as Prince of Wales, but in a role akin to sovereign in all but name. He proposed a symbolic crowning event, not a full coronation, but enough to communicate clearly to the world that the future of the monarchy now lay with William and Catherine. He would remain king, technically, but only in title. William would represent the crown. At first, William reportedly resisted. His words, according to the same aide, were nearly pleading, "It's too soon. Let's not talk about this yet." But Charles pressed on. He said this wasn't about ceremony or titles, it was about stability. "If I wait," Charles explained, "this institution could collapse in the vacuum." Catherine, ever the peacemaker, said little during the exchange. But her silence, as one source noted, was telling. This was not a burden she had expected to carry so soon. Only months prior, she had been focused on her children's education, charitable engagements, and a carefully curated public image. Now, she was being asked to step into a global spotlight as the likely future queen, not in some distant future, but within the year. As the conversation ended, Charles stood slowly, with effort, and walked toward the window. Looking out over the Windsor Gardens, he said something that chilled both William and Catherine. "I thought I had time. But the crown waits for no one." What followed was not immediate action. There were still layers of bureaucracy, layers of protocol to manage. But make no mistake, this was the moment the decision was made. Not in Parliament, not in a cathedral, not before cheering crowds or international cameras, but in a private drawing room in Windsor Castle, with only 3 people present, bound together by blood, duty, and the quiet terror of what lay ahead. The days that followed the breakdown were marked by a frantic but discreet flurry of activity. Lawyers, religious officials, and constitutional advisors were quietly brought into the fold. Meetings were held at odd hours to avoid press detection. A contingency plan was drawn up, codenamed Transition Eclipse, to prepare for the public phase of the symbolic handover. Every movement was cloaked in secrecy, but inside the palace, the reality was setting in fast. King Charles had surrendered to the inevitability of his own decline. Yet the public saw none of this. Instead, they were greeted with carefully managed photo ops of Charles attending spring garden events, smiling gently beside Camilla, waving from palace balconies. None of it showed the growing difficulty he had standing without support. None of it revealed the complex web of medications he was now reliant upon. And none of it betrayed the grief, the fear, and the resignation he carried with him behind the scenes. But those closest to the king knew the truth. The man who had waited his entire life to wear the crown had just lived through his most human moment. Not as a ruler, not as a figurehead, but as a man losing control of the time he had left. And in that moment of collapse, the course of history quietly shifted. Not with fanfare or royal decree, but with the sound of tears falling into silence in a dark room at Windsor. The call went out under the highest level of discretion. No press releases, no royal carriages or ceremonial arrivals. Just a string of encrypted messages, burner phone calls, and veiled requests delivered through longtime staff trusted not only with their discretion, but with their silence. The recipients of the message all shared something in common. They were not just part of the royal family. They were part of the succession plan. And the plan, once buried under layers of tradition and time, had been brought forward in haste. Within 24 hours of the Windsor breakdown, a private family summit was convened at Sandringham Estate. Though the royal residence had once been a holiday haven for the Windsors, it now served as a war room, a staging ground for one of the most delicate transitions in modern monarchy. Every corner of the estate was swept for surveillance. Phones were confiscated. Access was restricted to a select group that included Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Catherine, Princess Anne, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Conspicuously absent was Prince Harry, reportedly unreachable during the final hours of planning. Those who arrived at Sandringham found the estate blanketed in fog, both literal and figurative. Aides escorted each family member in through side entrances. There would be no public acknowledgement of their presence. Official calendars showed them elsewhere, Catherine at a children's hospital in Surrey, William attending an environmental summit. But behind closed doors, the future of the monarchy was being redrafted line by line. The summit began in silence, the kind that carries the weight of unspoken fears. King Charles, seated at the head of a long oak table, looked physically diminished but mentally clear. He opened with no preamble, no gentle build-up, just one quiet sentence: "We can't pretend anymore." The gravity of that moment pierced the room like cold steel. Princess Anne, ever the pragmatist, leaned forward, asking, "How bad is it, Charles?" He replied not with words, but by sliding a manila folder down the table. Inside was a copy of the same medical report he had reviewed days earlier, including a summary that left no room for denial. Multiple cerebral microbleeds, progressive vascular degeneration, and growing evidence of cognitive erosion. And read in silence, her brow tightening as she scanned the document. Catherine placed a hand over her mouth. William stared blankly ahead. And Camilla, her voice low, muttered, "This is madness." But the madness wasn't just in the diagnosis. It was in the decision Charles had already made. The king stood, slowly, and laid out his plan. Not a resignation, not a formal abdication, but a ceremonial handover of responsibility. One that would effectively elevate William and Catherine to the operational center of the monarchy. Charles would remain king in name, but only symbolically. All decision-making power, state representation, and ceremonial duties would shift to his son and daughter-in-law immediately. The room erupted in overlapping reactions and demanded clarity. Has Parliament seen this? Have they even been consulted? Camilla asked bitterly, "And what of the Queen? What becomes of my title when I'm no longer the active consort?" William, visibly distressed, said, "You're asking me to take the crown from a man who isn't dead." But Charles was firm. "I am not asking. I am informing you." What followed was a brutal exchange that pulled no punches, and questioned whether the monarchy could survive such a shock without triggering calls for a republic. Camilla accused Charles of handing the institution over to a generation she wasn't convinced was ready. And William, in the most heated words he had spoken to his father in years, reportedly said, "You taught me to wait. You told me the crown is earned through endurance. Now you're cutting the line because you're scared." Charles didn't deny it. Yes, he said. I'm scared. I'm scared that if I die in silence, we'll have no plan. I'm scared the nation will see chaos instead of continuity. I'm scared of the void. It was Catherine who broke the deadlock. Speaking quietly, but with unmistakable certainty, she said, then we need to do this right. Not behind curtains. Not in shadows. If we're going to carry this forward, it has to be on our terms, not in secret. That statement changed the tone of the summit. The emotional chaos gave way to pragmatic discussion. A strategy began to emerge, one that could balance Charles's fading health with the public's need for stability. They agreed on a new framework. William and Catherine would assume a larger public role immediately, stepping into state functions, foreign diplomacy, and Commonwealth engagements. A symbolic ritual would take place in a private chapel, witnessed by the church and select members of the family. And in a nod to tradition, the Archbishop would offer a blessing that recognized William and Catherine as the future sovereigns, even before the throne officially passed to them. It was a compromise born of desperation, but also vision. Over the next 2 hours, details were debated line by line. When should the public be told? Who should attend the private transition event? What language would be used to avoid sparking legal or political backlash? Would the Prime Minister be involved? How would the Commonwealth realms be notified? And insisted on safeguards. There must be no ambiguity, she warned. If we do this halfway, we'll be accused of manipulating the system for emotional sympathy. Either it's constitutional, or it's chaos. Camilla was less diplomatic. At one point, she openly questioned whether Catherine had the resolve for the role. There's a difference, she said, between being liked and being obeyed. The comment was icy and calculated, but Catherine held her gaze and replied with equal calm. Then let the public decide. Tensions eventually cooled, but not because there was consensus. Rather, it became clear to everyone in the room that events had already begun spinning beyond control. Charles's health would not pause for their deliberations. Time was no longer a luxury. They needed to prepare the world for what was coming, even if they hadn't yet figured out how to survive it themselves. By the end of the summit, roles were assigned, and would serve as liaison to Parliament. Catherine would begin coordinating with the Archbishop on the symbolic ceremony. William would oversee strategic messaging, preparing to address the nation when the time came. And Camilla, after a long silence, agreed to remain in place, supportive but increasingly sidelined. As they departed the estate, each carried more than just a duty. They carried a secret, one so enormous it defied language. The monarchy had always been built on tradition, protocol, and patience. Now it was being rebuilt in real time, on the foundation of a man's mortality. Outside Sandringham, the fog began to lift. But inside, the storm had only just begun. It wasn't written on royal parchment, nor delivered through the formal channels of the Privy Council. No heralds announced it. No church bells rang in solemn tribute. There was no formal abdication speech, no velvet-draped stage, no crowd of reporters outside the palace gates. And yet, the decision King Charles III made in the shadows of his final clarity would come to reshape the monarchy as deeply as any official proclamation before it. Charles had always been a planner. Friends and foes alike described him as methodical, occasionally obsessive, and driven by a desire to leave things in order. He studied history not as a curiosity, but as a manual, a guidebook to what worked and what failed. As such, he knew better than anyone the cautionary tale of Edward VIII, whose abdication had not only shaken the monarchy, but cast a shadow that lingered for generations. Charles had no desire to repeat that mistake, but he also had no intention of letting the crown slip into chaos due to his own unraveling health. His plan had to be different, quiet, calculated, and crafted within the narrowest space the British Constitution would allow. He couldn't abdicate outright. The word itself carried too much political and emotional weight. But he could, with the right wording, the right rituals, and the right endorsements, transfer the practical power of the crown to his son. If it looked like duty, not defeat, the public might accept it. If it felt sacred, not political, the church might bless it. If it wasn't permanent, but provisional, Parliament might not object. Thus was born the plan Charles dubbed, in his personal notes, as the Gentle Descent. It began with a single document, written in the king's own hand, locked in his personal study at Highgrove House. It was not a resignation. It was a letter of intent. In it, Charles detailed his reasoning for stepping back, citing not only his physical decline but the emotional and mental toll that had accompanied it. He wrote about the weight of expectation, the fear of destabilizing an already fragile royal image, and the belief that the monarchy's strength came from continuity, not personal pride. Most tellingly, he emphasized the importance of preparing the nation for its next monarch while he was still lucid enough to guide the process. The letter was addressed to three individuals: the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, and Prince William. Each copy carried an identical final paragraph. "This is not the end of my reign. It is the preparation for its conclusion. May it be dignified, deliberate, and without spectacle." The Archbishop was the first to receive his copy. A private meeting was arranged in the chapel of St. James's Palace, far from the public eye. Charles and the Archbishop spoke for over 2 hours. While the details of their conversation remain undisclosed, sources familiar with the meeting say it centered around one question: could a monarch spiritually delegate authority without formally relinquishing the throne? The Archbishop reportedly wrestled with this. There was no precedent, not within the Church's framework, for such a symbolic yet impactful act. But ultimately, he agreed that the greater sin would be allowing instability to flourish in the name of ceremony. He gave his blessing privately, cautiously, but unequivocally. The Prime Minister's response was more political. At first, there was concern. An unexpected power shift within the monarchy could trigger debates about its very existence. But once the king assured the PM that no legal abdication was being pursued, merely a transfer of visible duty, with full constitutional consultation, the tone softened. In the end, the Prime Minister agreed not to obstruct the process, under 2 conditions. It must be seen as Charles's personal decision, not a government directive. And it must not involve the altering of legal titles without formal legislative approval. The most emotional response came from Prince William. According to palace insiders, when he received his father's letter, he spent nearly an hour alone before speaking to anyone. The contents were deeply personal, more confessional than constitutional. In the letter, Charles expressed love, pride, and regret. He apologized for moments of distance, praised William's patience, and implored him to lead not just with duty, but with empathy. William, known for his stoic composure, reportedly cried as he finished the final line: "You are ready, and I am no longer able to delay what is already written in the stars." The official architecture of the gentle descent began to take shape. A private council was assembled, comprised of legal scholars, royal advisors, constitutional experts, and historians. Their task was simple but unprecedented: design a transition process that allowed Charles to remain king in title, while William and Catherine took on the effective duties of the crown. This would include state visits, ceremonial appointments, and acting as the face of the monarchy in the international arena. To avoid public panic, the advisors decided the process would unfold in 3 phases. Phase 1 would be the announcement of William and Catherine's expanded roles. This would be presented as a continuation of the late Queen Elizabeth's shared monarchy model, where senior royals gradually absorb more responsibility. Phase 2 would introduce the concept of delegated regency, a term crafted to imply royal authorization without triggering constitutional crisis. Under this phase, William would officially act on Charles's behalf in all state matters, with Charles offering written approval behind the scenes. Phase 3 would be a ceremonial handover, conducted in a private chapel with only key family members, church officials, and a few select witnesses. It would not be a coronation. There would be no crown placed on William's head. Instead, there would be a laying on of hands, a symbolic gesture rooted in ancient religious practice, where Charles would offer a blessing and pronounce William and Catherine as the sovereigns in spirit and in duty. Once all 3 phases were complete, Charles would withdraw from public life, retreating to Highgrove and Balmoral, making only rare appearances and issuing occasional public messages. The monarchy, in effect, would have changed hands, even though the crown remained, on paper, with Charles. The risk of backlash was enormous. One misstep could ignite a constitutional crisis or embolden Republican voices. But Charles believed the alternative, dragging the nation through a slow, public decline, would be worse. He had seen what happened to monarchies that clung to power until the bitter end. He was determined not to be remembered as a king who fell apart in the public eye. Camilla's reaction to this plan was reserved, at least at first. She had always known Charles to be deliberate, even stubborn. But this was a surrender in her eyes, no matter how he tried to frame it. For a woman who had endured decades of vilification just to stand beside her husband as queen, The idea of fading into the background as William and Catherine stepped forward felt like erasure. One aide described Camilla as quietly devastated. She did not fight the plan publicly, but she also did not endorse it. Instead, she began making her own adjustments, downsizing her staff, canceling public engagements, and avoiding major family functions. Some viewed it as dignified retreat. Others saw it as the first rift in a royal couple that had survived everything until now. And yet, even in the tension, the plan moved forward. Palace press officers were briefed on language to use. Photographers were instructed to focus their lenses more on William and Catherine in public outings. A new communications protocol was issued. Inquiries about state matters would be directed to William's office. Charles's calendar was gradually cleared. Slowly, and with almost surgical precision, the transition began to unfold. To the public, it appeared as a natural evolution, an aging monarch letting the younger generation shine. But behind the scenes, every move was choreographed with precision to mask the truth. King Charles had made the ultimate decision, not to abdicate, not to resign, but to let go in the only way he could. Quietly, purposefully, and with the full knowledge that he would not be present to see the end result. He had made peace with that. At Highgrove, Charles reportedly began a personal project, writing a memoir, not for publication, but for his grandchildren. In it, he reflects on his life, his regrets, and his dreams for the monarchy they will inherit. It is said to contain pages devoted to Harry, to William, to Catherine, and even to Diana. As he wrote in one passage, leaked by a palace staffer who glimpsed a draft, "The crown is not a prize. It is a burden we carry until our shoulders no longer can. And when that day comes, we must pass it, not as kings." When Catherine Middleton married Prince William in 2011, the world watched a fairy tale unfold. A commoner from Berkshire had entered the world of royalty, and for many, she represented a fresh chapter in the House of Windsor. She smiled gracefully from the balcony at Buckingham Palace, waved to adoring crowds, and stepped into her role with the elegance and restraint expected of a future queen. But as the years passed, what few noticed was how deliberately she kept one foot in the world she came from. Even as she moved through palace halls, she never let go of her grounding, her calm, or her craving for normalcy. Now, that sense of control was unraveling. When King Charles disclosed his condition and intentions during the family summit, it wasn't just William who was handed the future, it was Catherine, too. And the crown she had prepared for in theory suddenly loomed with an oppressive reality. Behind closed doors, she was no longer simply the Duchess of Cambridge or the Princess of Wales. She was being groomed for the throne, not in 20 years, not even in 10, but now. The burden of that shift weighed heavily on her, even if she didn't show it in public. At home, Catherine confided to close friends and longtime staff that she wasn't sure she was ready. Not emotionally, not politically, not as a mother of 3 children still in school, 2 of whom were now at the center of a national dynasty. She feared what this change would do to them, and she feared what it would take from her. Unlike William, whose entire life had been shaped by the inevitability of kingship, Catherine had once dreamed of a quieter future, one in which she could balance duty with privacy, motherhood with service. Now that balance was being shattered. Every move she made, every word she spoke, every public appearance was being dissected through a new lens. Future queen. Inside palace walls, preparations began to reshape her daily life. Her schedule, once built around family routines and engagements with charities, was quietly transformed. Her time was reallocated to state briefings, security coordination, foreign relations crash courses, and mock diplomatic sessions with senior advisors. Every lunch now carried an agenda. Every wardrobe choice had to be reviewed in case she needed to appear sovereign at a moment's notice. Privately, Catherine struggled to find a foothold in the storm. She spent more time in the gardens of Kensington Palace, walking alone, speaking with longtime nannies and caretakers who had known her not as royalty, but as a mother. Some described her as quiet, pensive, even melancholic. She would ask about the children, George's new interest in chess, Charlotte's ballet classes, Louis's mischievous jokes, and then fall into silence, staring into the flowers as if trying to memorize something she feared she might lose. Because what few outside the royal circle realized was this: ascending the throne meant surrendering her life as she knew it. No more school drop-offs. No more informal get-togethers with friends. No more quiet weekends away from the cameras. Every step would now be scripted, every smile timed, every failure magnified. And while Catherine had long known this day might come, She had not expected it so soon, nor so violently, tearing its way through her family with a sense of dread, not ceremony. Her marriage, too, came under pressure. William, now consumed with the logistical and emotional weight of leading the monarchy before his time, became distant. Their once sacred evenings, spent laughing or talking quietly over tea, became strategic discussions: how to announce policy shifts, how to respond to Commonwealth leaders, how to manage Parliament's quiet skepticism about an accelerated crowning. Their love had not disappeared, but it had become buried beneath a mountain of responsibility. According to insiders, there were moments of intense private conflict between them. Catherine, known for her calm demeanor, was said to have raised her voice in frustration during one conversation behind palace doors, saying, "I am not a pawn in this." William, exhausted and equally frightened, reportedly replied, "None of us are. But we have to play the game anyway." The pressure mounted as her public presence increased. Every step she took outside the palace walls was a test run for queenship. Her speeches grew more formal. Her wardrobe became more regal. Photographers noted a subtle change in her posture: shoulders straighter, chin held a little higher, eyes more alert. She had begun the slow, quiet transformation into a sovereign, whether she wanted it or not. And yet, Catherine never publicly flinched. At a children's hospice opening in Yorkshire, she knelt beside a 6-year-old girl with terminal cancer and held her hand for 10 full minutes, asking questions about her favorite cartoons and her dreams. She laughed, she listened, and she stayed long after the cameras were turned off. That moment, captured quietly by a local staffer, spread like wildfire across the internet. It was unplanned, unscripted, and utterly real. In it, the British people saw something that no constitutional advisor could fabricate: empathy. The image of Catherine kneeling beside that child became the unofficial symbol of her reluctant rise, a queen-in-waiting who never asked for the spotlight but chose to carry it anyway. Still, doubt lingered in her heart. One night, weeks after the Sandringham summit, Catherine reportedly confided to a trusted aide while preparing for bed. She stood at her dressing table, removing her earrings slowly, the light from the mirror soft against her face. "Do you think they'll ever see me for who I really am?" she asked. The aide, caught off guard, responded with a simple truth: "They already do, ma'am. That's why they believe in you." But belief, Catherine knew, would not be enough. She had seen what fame and power had done to others, especially to Diana. The crown offered no protection from tragedy, no armor against public scrutiny. If anything, it magnified every imperfection, every mistake. And now, it was coming for her. Not with ceremony or celebration, but with a quiet force that stripped away her illusions about what it meant to be royal. In the following days, she began building a team, not of image consultants or PR experts, but of women. Former diplomats, child psychologists, public health advocates, education specialists, advisors who could help shape a reign rooted not in spectacle but in service. If she was going to be queen, she would not be a figurehead. She would be a voice. And if she was to walk into history, it would be with purpose, not just protocol. She also requested time with Queen Anne, her most trusted royal mentor. The two met in private several times over the course of a month, discussing everything from ceremonial procedures to emotional survival. And, who had lived her entire life in the monarchy's iron cage, offered blunt wisdom: "The crown doesn't bend to you. You bend to it. Just make sure you don't break." Those words stuck with Catherine. In public, she was now being addressed more often as "Your Future Majesty." Her signature was updated in palace records to reflect her elevated status. When she visited schools, teachers encouraged students to curtsy. Royal photographers began sending their images directly to international news agencies under the heading, "Catherine, the Queen-in-Waiting." And yet, the woman beneath it all still walked her children to school when she could, still baked cookies with them when no one was watching, still read bedtime stories in her dressing gown. Catherine had become two women in one, the sovereign in training, and the mother holding her family together. The weight of both roles was immense, but in carrying them both, she began to understand something few before her had. The crown was not just a symbol of power. It was a crucible, and she would either be forged by it or consumed. For a man raised in the public eye, Prince William had always worn his royal destiny with quiet discipline. He had never sought attention like his younger brother, nor tried to distance himself from duty. From the moment he could walk beside his father, he was taught to lead, not by ambition, but by example. And for decades, he had prepared for a future he believed would come slowly, giving him time to shape his own values, raise his children, and support the monarchy from a distance before being thrust to the forefront. But time, it seemed, had other plans. When Charles announced his intention to hand over the ceremonial reins, William did not react with relief or triumph. He reacted with dread. Behind his calm demeanor and rehearsed handshakes, he was battling a storm few knew existed. He had been prepared to ascend, but not like this. Not because his father was dying. Not because the monarchy stood at the edge of uncertainty. And not with the weight of his entire family's future falling on him overnight. In the days following the Sandringham summit, William retreated emotionally. Palace insiders noted a stark shift in his behavior. Meetings that once lasted an hour stretched to 3 as he struggled to absorb a sudden flood of legal, constitutional, and ceremonial briefings. He slept less, ate sporadically. His security detail reported that he began taking long solo walks through Kensington Palace gardens after midnight, sometimes without alerting anyone beforehand. When aides expressed concern, he simply said, "I need to think." But thinking turned to brooding, and brooding turned to restlessness. There was pressure from all sides. From his father, who needed him to stabilize the monarchy. From the church, which demanded he begin preparing for the spiritual responsibilities of kingship. From the government, which had already begun consulting him privately on matters traditionally reserved for the reigning monarch. And from the public, whose faith in the monarchy now rested heavily on the image of William and Catherine as the future. Privately, he confided to an advisor, "I'm being watched every second. Every blink is a headline. Every pause is a conspiracy. This isn't leadership, it's surveillance." But perhaps the most painful part of the transition wasn't the weight of responsibility. It was the silence between him and his brother. For all the fractures between William and Harry, there had still been an unspoken understanding. They were the only two who truly understood what it meant to grow up under a global microscope. In childhood, they shared rooms and secrets. In adolescence, they leaned on each other through their mother's death and the suffocating royal protocols that followed. In adulthood, however, that closeness fractured. And now, when William needed his brother most, Harry was unreachable, his silence louder than ever. According to a source close to William, he sent multiple messages to Harry following the Sandringham summit. Not through palace staff, but personally, texts, voicemails, even a handwritten letter delivered by a private courier. Each message was the same in tone. "I don't care about the past right now. I just need my brother." None of them were returned. That silence created an emotional vacuum. William began second-guessing himself. Was he taking the crown too soon? Had their family already fallen apart beyond repair? Was the monarchy even worth preserving if it meant doing it alone? These were not rhetorical questions. They became private obsessions. One night, according to a royal staffer, William sat alone in his study for over 2 hours, reading over transcripts from his father's public addresses over the past year. He was looking for signs, clues that Charles had been preparing for this handover all along. Instead, he found a man struggling to appear stronger than he truly was. In speech after speech, Charles spoke of serving with humility, of ensuring continuity, of honoring the memory of my mother. But between the lines, William now saw exhaustion, fragility, a man bidding farewell in increments. That realization crushed him. He began to realize that his anger toward his father wasn't truly about the burden being passed to him. It was about loss. He was losing the last piece of the man who had raised him, who had taught him the ropes with equal parts formality and affection. For all their differences, Charles had been a fixture in William's life, a steady hand, a sounding board, a stubborn but loving presence. And now, William was being asked to not only accept that loss but to fill the space his father would soon leave behind. This internal turmoil started to manifest in quiet but telling ways. During a high-profile engagement with foreign diplomats, William reportedly stumbled while addressing a question about the monarchy's direction. His words, though respectful, lacked his usual conviction. Observers described him as distant and measured to a fault, noting a distinct absence of warmth in his tone. At home, Catherine noticed the change. She encouraged him to rest, to delegate more, but he resisted. "If I fall apart now," he told her during a late-night conversation, "then everything Dad did will have been for nothing." Her reply was simple: "Then don't fall. Walk." To help him manage the pressure, senior advisors created a rotating strategy council, a team of constitutional experts, speechwriters, media strategists, and Commonwealth liaisons. Their goal was to insulate William from unnecessary political distractions and give him the tools to act with increasing autonomy. But William, never one for delegation when something felt personal, often pushed them aside. He insisted on writing many of his public remarks himself. He reviewed documents personally before engagements. He requested personal briefings from Parliament rather than summaries. It wasn't about control. It was about clarity. He couldn't lead with borrowed words. He needed to know, deeply and intimately, what was being asked of him and what he was giving back. Despite the exhaustion, William began to lean into his new role with quiet determination. At a private engagement with veterans, he took off his gloves in the freezing cold to shake every hand personally. When asked about his father's condition, he responded without hesitation, "He's still the king, and I'm just doing what any son would do, standing by him." That moment, captured on video, went viral. It wasn't grand. It wasn't polished. But it was real. And in that authenticity, the public found reassurance. But the real turning point came weeks later, during a private meeting with his father. Charles had requested a conversation alone, without advisors or aides. The two men sat in a sunlit study at Clarence House. Charles, more frail than William remembered, struggled to lift a teacup without assistance. There was no ceremony, no titles, just father and son. Charles looked at William and said, "You don't have to be me. You have to be better." William didn't reply for a long time. When he did, he whispered, "I don't know how." Charles smiled faintly. "That's why you will." That moment, by all accounts, began to shift something deep inside William. It didn't erase the fear. It didn't lighten the burden, but it reframed it. He wasn't just filling a role. He was carrying a legacy. And in carrying it, he could reshape it. From that point on, his posture changed. He walked straighter, spoke with more certainty, began addressing foreign leaders not as a prince, but as a representative of the crown. He didn't ask for approval. He didn't seek validation. He simply acted, because the monarchy now required it. Behind the scenes, however, he remained aware of his limitations. He sought counsel more often from Princess and, leaning on her deep institutional knowledge. He spent longer hours preparing for meetings, even practicing hypothetical scenarios with palace staff. And above all, he clung to Catherine, not just as a partner, but as his anchor. She was the only one who knew the toll behind the headlines, the cost behind the crown. And yet, even as he found his footing, one truth remained unspoken. The crown may be inevitable, but peace was not. The pressure, the scrutiny, the emotional cost, it would never leave him. The role of a king wasn't just about duty. It was about endurance. And as he stood on the edge of that role, Prince William realized he wasn't just stepping into history. He was stepping into a storm that had already begun. From the outside, Queen Camilla maintained the image of composure. She walked with Charles during brief public outings, kept up her appearances at garden parties and literacy events, and smiled politely for the cameras, even as whispers of her growing absence from private functions circulated through the media. But behind palace walls, those closest to her saw a different story, a woman who felt her life's sacrifices unraveling in real time, thread by thread. Camilla had spent decades shaping her role in the royal family. For years, she endured ridicule, cold stares, and front-page headlines branding her as the other woman. She bore the shame silently, retreating from public comment and focusing instead on becoming the kind of partner Charles needed, steady, supportive, and out of the spotlight when it counted. Her reward came slowly. When Charles finally ascended the throne, Camilla was officially crowned queen consort, a title she never demanded but fought tooth and nail to defend. Now, only a few years later, she felt it being stripped from her, not by scandal, not by failure, but by time and illness, and decisions she had no power to stop. When Charles first revealed his intent to transfer his ceremonial and functional duties to William, Camilla listened quietly. She didn't argue. She didn't weep. She nodded, understanding the gravity of his words, but not fully accepting them. Her silence, according to one royal aide, wasn't consent. It was containment. Because what brewed beneath her calm expression was fury. Not the loud, unfiltered anger of someone blindsided, but the quiet, simmering kind that burns in the background, gaining heat with every ignored warning, every bypassed conversation. Camilla didn't object in public or in meetings, but she began pulling back. She declined invitations to informal briefings. She grew terse with palace staff. She took meals alone more often. And most tellingly, she canceled several appearances that had once been cornerstones of her personal causes. Those who spoke with her during that period reported a consistent theme in her private conversations. She felt discarded. She had always known that William and Catherine were the future, But she hadn't expected to be pushed aside so early, so unceremoniously. To her, it felt as if Charles had made a unilateral decision, one that diminished not only his own reign, but hers as well. She had stood by him through Diana's death, through years of being publicly despised, through family tensions and health scares, all to help him build a legacy. And now, she watched that legacy quietly fold into a ceremonial act that placed her squarely on the sidelines. One close friend of Camilla's confided to a journalist off the record, saying, "She feels like the queen of a reign that never truly began." The tension between her and Charles grew, even if it was rarely visible to the public. Their conversations, once full of laughter and warmth, grew sparse and functional. She tried to raise her concerns with him in private, about the optics of a premature handover, the risk of destabilizing the monarchy, the hurt she felt being cut out of decisions. But Charles, weakened by illness and burdened by legacy, often responded with silence or. Once, during a late evening in Clarence's house, Camilla reportedly confronted him directly. The room was dimly lit. Charles was seated in an armchair, going over briefing notes. She stood across from him and said, "You're handing the crown to them, Charles. And in doing so, you're erasing us." Charles didn't look up immediately. When he did, his voice was tired. "It's not about us anymore. It's about what survives after." Camilla didn't respond. She simply turned and walked out of the room. From that moment on, she began carving out her own quiet response. Not in rebellion, but in withdrawal. She instructed her personal secretary to limit all future engagements. She began returning gifts sent by royal patrons. At a luncheon with several Commonwealth representatives, she offered an unscripted toast in which she remarked, "Sometimes, being royal means learning when to disappear with grace." The comment was subtle, almost poetic, but deeply pointed. Within the palace, staff began whispering about her silent exile. She stopped attending transition briefings altogether. She declined involvement in the planning of the symbolic handover ceremony. When asked whether she wished to be present at the private blessing that would symbolically anoint William and Catherine, she said only, "Let the future have its day." This wasn't a surrender. It was a protest in quiet motion. Those closest to Camilla say she didn't wish to sabotage the transition. In fact, she still believed in the crown's importance and in William and Catherine's capacity to lead. But she resented how it was being done, without consultation, without warning, without acknowledgement of what she had endured to legitimize the throne they were now poised to inherit. Her absence began to create awkward gaps at events. Foreign dignitaries noted her disappearance from key receptions. Tabloid headlines questioned her health, while insiders knew it wasn't her body that was struggling, it was her heart. She had become a witness to the slow erasure of her own role in history. More privately, Camilla began taking solace in her horses, spending hours at her countryside stables, away from the cameras and the palace formalities. There, she could ride without title, speak without filters, and be simply Camilla once again. The staff at the stables reported a visible transformation when she was away from London. She was lighter, louder, more present. But always, she returned with hesitation, as if re-entering a house that no longer felt like her own. One evening, Charles sent her a letter, not a note from his private secretary, but a handwritten message in his own hand. In it, he acknowledged the pain she felt and thanked her for her silence, her grace, and her years of sacrifice. The final line read, "Whatever history writes of me, it cannot write it without you." Camilla never replied. She kept the letter in a drawer, folded neatly beneath a photo of the two of them on their wedding day. She didn't need to respond. The words, while kind, didn't change the outcome. She had been queen, yes, but not in the way she had hoped. Not with the public at her side. Not with a nation fully embracing her role. And certainly not with the time to show the world who she truly was behind the headlines. She had expected a reign. What she received was a season. Still, even in the quiet corners of her fury, Camilla retained her dignity. She issued no public statements. She avoided leaks or scandal. She remained, to the end, a queen who knew that sometimes the crown does not fall with a crash, but fades into silence. By the time William and Catherine's elevation became a public inevitability, Camilla had already transitioned herself out of relevance. She no longer hosted receptions. She no longer attended family strategy meetings. She was present at ceremonial moments, yes, but as an observer, not a participant. To the watching public, she was still queen consort. But to herself, she was now something else entirely, a woman who had stood beside a king as he faded, and who quietly stepped aside before history could decide what to do with her.